Even after the Revolutionary War was won, King George III remained the most dangerous threat to George Washington's presidency. British troops refused to leave U.S. territory, still occupying forts along the frontier in open defiance of the peace treaty. The British armed Native American tribes resisting American expansion and used their navy to cripple U.S. ships. Behind it all was George III, the monarch who had lost the war but never accepted American independence. John Adams's presidency was nearly derailed by France's foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. As tensions rose during the French Revolutionary Wars, French ships began seizing American vessels. When Adams sent diplomats to negotiate peace, Talleyrand demanded bribes just to begin talks, an act that triggered the XYZ affair. The scandal sparked public outrage and led to an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. Talleyrand's actions pushed the U.S. to the brink of full-scale war and forced Adams to choose between peace and party loyalty. Thomas Jefferson's most dangerous enemy sat a heartbeat from the presidency. After being dropped from Jefferson's second term, Vice President Aaron Burr conspired to raise a private army, seize Western territory, and form a breakaway nation. Though never convicted of treason, Burr's actions, backed by foreign offers and secret supporters, risked splitting the country just as it was finding its footing. He was tried under Jefferson's own Justice Department, making it one of the most serious internal threats any president had faced to that point. As British Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool oversaw the war effort against the United States. Under his leadership, Britain blockaded American ports, seized ships, and authorized the burning of Washington, D.C. British troops torched the White House and Capitol, while James Madison fled the capital. Liverpool's policies were meant to punish the U.S. for defying British naval supremacy. He never set foot on American soil, but his orders brought the U.S. government to its knees. Though Spain was a fading empire, James Monroe's greatest foreign obstacle was its ambassador, Luis de Onís. As the U.S. pushed into Spanish Florida, Onís refused to negotiate from weakness, dragging out diplomatic efforts while Spain armed native groups to resist American settlers. Monroe finally authorized Andrew Jackson to invade Florida, applying military pressure that forced Spain's hand. The standoff nearly caused a broader conflict and shaped Monroe's aggressive foreign policy for years. John Quincy Adams's presidency was haunted by the man he defeated. Andrew Jackson, furious over the so-called corrupt bargain of 1824, spent 4 years undermining Adams at every turn. Jackson's allies in Congress blocked legislation, attacked Adams in the press, and launched a populist movement that crushed him in the 1828 rematch. No president before Adams faced such a relentless, organized campaign of revenge from a rival, and it worked. As president of the Second Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle held enormous influence over the nation's economy. Andrew Jackson viewed him as the embodiment of elite corruption and a direct threat to democracy. Their showdown, known as the Bank War, saw Jackson veto the bank's renewal and remove federal funds, while Biddle retaliated by tightening credit to punish the economy. The feud destabilized the financial system and cemented Jackson's image as a populist warrior against entrenched power. When the Panic of 1837 hit, Martin Van Buren refused to intervene, insisting the government had no role in rescuing the economy. As the crisis deepened, Henry Clay led the opposition in Congress, blaming Van Buren's hard money policies for widespread suffering. Clay pushed to revive the national bank and used the Depression to fuel a Whig resurgence. He became Van Buren's most visible critic and the political face of a public rapidly losing confidence. William Henry Harrison's presidency was too short for political enemies to fully emerge, so we've gone with something different. Harrison's presidency was not ended by his term running out, by war or scandal, but by illness. At age 68, he insisted on delivering the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, nearly 2 hours, in cold, wet weather without a coat or hat. Within weeks, he developed a respiratory infection, likely pneumonia, that progressed rapidly. Doctors tried bloodletting, opium, and castor oil, but nothing helped. Just 31 days after taking office, Harrison passed away, making him the shortest-serving president in American history. John Tyler entered office without a party and made enemies fast. Whig leader Henry Clay, making his second appearance on this list, expected him to serve as a figurehead after Harrison's passing, but Tyler had other plans. When he vetoed Clay's proposal to re-establish a national bank, Clay turned on him completely. Tyler was formally expelled from the Whig Party while still in office, leaving him politically isolated and without a base in Congress. Clay spent the next 3 years undermining Tyler's agenda and legitimacy, turning what should have been a smooth succession into one of the most combative terms in early presidential history. James K. Polk's expansionist agenda brought him into direct conflict with Mexico's most cunning military leader. Antonio López de Santa Anna returned from exile promising peace, only to take command of Mexican forces once back in power. Polk's war for Texas and the Southwest became bloodier than expected, with Santa Anna leading massive counterattacks at battles like Buena Vista. Though ultimately defeated, he prolonged the war, raised its cost in blood and treasure, and helped turn Polk's popular campaign into a controversial legacy. A fierce defender of slavery, South Carolina's Robert Barnwell Rhett saw Zachary Taylor as a traitor to the South. When Taylor backed California's entry as a free state and vowed to crush any secessionist revolt, Rhett pushed back hard, calling for a Southern convention to consider breaking from the Union. As tensions flared, Rhett emerged as the face of pro-slavery extremism and the loudest voice for disunion. In Taylor's short presidency, no single figure posed a more direct challenge. As president, Millard Fillmore enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, which required officials in free states to return escaped slaves. This ignited outrage across the North, and no one led the charge louder than abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Through his newspaper, The Liberator, Garrison denounced Fillmore as morally bankrupt and accused him of siding with tyranny over justice. His relentless attacks helped galvanize anti-slavery sentiment in the North, turning Fillmore's attempt at compromise into a public relations disaster that divided the country even further. Franklin Pierce hoped to ease sectional tensions by letting territories decide the enslavement issue themselves, but his support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act backfired. The law sparked violence between pro- and anti-slavery settlers, and into the chaos stepped John Brown. After taking the lives of pro-slavery men in Kansas, Brown became the face of violent abolitionism. His actions made Pierce's administration look weak and lawless, and Bleeding Kansas turned the president's signature policy into a national scandal he could not control. Before he led the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis was a U.S. Senator and James Buchanan's most dangerous enemy. Davis fiercely defended slavery, rejected compromise, and encouraged Southern states to secede after Lincoln's election. Buchanan insisted the federal government had no authority to stop them, allowing Davis and his allies to organize in plain sight. By the time Buchanan left office, 7 states had already seceded. Davis had broken the Union and was preparing to lead it in war. Jefferson Davis had been pushing for secession during Buchanan's presidency, but under Lincoln, he became the enemy in full. As president of the Confederacy, Davis organized a rebellion that split the country in two, resulting in over 600,000 lives lost and forcing Lincoln to lead the Union through its greatest crisis. He organized armies, had authorized the attack on Fort Sumter, and fought to preserve slavery through war. For 4 years, Davis challenged Lincoln on every front: military, political, and ideological. No foreign power ever came as close to destroying the United States as the man who once served in its Senate. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson clashed immediately with radical Republicans over how to rebuild the South. No one opposed him more fiercely than Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, who viewed Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies as a betrayal of the Union's victory. Stevens pushed for military occupation of the South, full rights for freed men, and the impeachment of the president himself. Johnson vetoed dozens of Republican bills, only to see Congress override them. Stevens became the architect of Johnson's downfall, leading the charge to strip him of power and force him into political irrelevance. While Ulysses S. Grant fought to rebuild the nation and protect the rights of freed men, his administration was haunted by the rot of corruption. The most notorious figure behind that image was William Boss Tweed, head of New York's Tammany Hall. Tweed controlled elections, contracts, and courts through bribery and fraud, funneling millions in public money into private pockets. Though Grant himself wasn't implicated, his failure to root out men like Tweed tarnished his presidency. Tweed became a symbol of the graft that Grant couldn't escape and couldn't stop. Rutherford B. Hayes entered office with his legitimacy in question. After losing the popular vote, he was awarded the presidency by a special electoral commission following backroom negotiations that pulled federal troops out of the South. His opponent, Samuel J. Tilden, had won more votes and was widely seen as the rightful winner. Tilden never formally contested the outcome, but his supporters spent Hayes's entire term undermining him. Hayes governed under a cloud of suspicion, with Democrats blocking his reforms and branding him his fraudulency. James A. Garfield had ambitious plans to reform the federal bureaucracy, but he never got a chance to carry them out. Just 4 months into his presidency, he was shot by Charles Guiteau, a mentally unstable office seeker who believed Garfield owed him a job. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but poor medical care and infection dragged his suffering out for months. Garfield finally passed away that September. Guiteau was quickly arrested and executed. Chester A. Arthur owed his political rise to Roscoe Conkling, the powerful New York senator and leader of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. But once in office, Arthur shocked everyone, including Conkling, by embracing civil service reform. When he signed the Pendleton Act, which began dismantling the patronage system Conkling had built, it was seen as a personal betrayal. Conkling and his allies turned against Arthur, stripping him of political support. Grover Cleveland was a staunch defender of the gold standard at a time when populist anger over debt and deflation was sweeping the country. Leading the charge for free silver was Senator Francis Cockrell of Missouri, a powerful voice for the agrarian movement. Cockrell and his allies argued that abandoning gold would relieve struggling farmers and expand the economy, while Cleveland warned it would destroy financial stability. The battle divided the Democratic Party and weakened Cleveland's political base. As agrarian discontent grew across the South and Midwest, Benjamin Harrison faced a new political threat, the Populist Party. Led by James B. Weaver, a former Union general, the Populists demanded radical reforms, government control of railroads, free silver, and a progressive income tax. In 1892, Weaver ran against Harrison and Grover Cleveland, winning over 1 million votes and carrying 4 states. Though Weaver didn't win, he exposed deep fractures in the electorate and siphoned support from Harris's Republican base at a time when economic anxiety was already undermining the administration. William McKinley had just been reelected and was riding a wave of national optimism when his presidency ended abruptly. At a public reception in Buffalo, New York, he was shot point-blank range by Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist who believed McKinley represented the corruption of capitalism and state power. McKinley lingered for over a week before passing away from gangrene. The incident sent shockwaves through the country and elevated Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Czolgosz became a symbol of domestic radicalism and the lone figure whom succeeded in stopping McKinley where no foreign or political rival had. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was defined by his war on monopolies, and no one represented corporate power more than J.P. Morgan. When Roosevelt filed an antitrust lawsuit against Morgan's Northern Securities Company, it marked the first time a sitting president had directly challenged one of the nation's most powerful financiers. Morgan, stunned, tried to negotiate privately, but Roosevelt refused. Their battle became the opening in Roosevelt's broader crusade against trusts, making Morgan not just an economic opponent, but the face of everything Roosevelt believed was threatening American democracy. William Howard Taft never expected that his greatest rival would be the man who had once handpicked him for the presidency. But after becoming disillusioned with Taft's policies, Theodore Roosevelt returned to politics with a vengeance, forming the Progressive Party and accusing Taft of betraying reform. Their feud split the Republican vote in 1912, handing the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. The two former friends became bitter enemies, and Roosevelt's public attacks made Taft appear timid, conservative, and out of touch with the political moment. As World War I escalated in Europe, Woodrow Wilson tried to keep the U.S. neutral, but Germany's provocations made that impossible. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German Empire launched unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ships and taking out civilians. The interception of the Zimmermann telegram, which proposed a German-Mexican alliance against the U.S., forced Wilson's hand. Declaring war in 1917, Wilson turned the nation into a wartime power. The Kaiser had pushed him too far, and in doing so, turned a callous academic into a global wartime president. Warren G. Harding's presidency was meant to restore normalcy after World War I, but scandal derailed it. The worst came from inside his own cabinet. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome to private companies in exchange for bribes. When the scheme unraveled, it became one of the biggest scandals in American political history. Harding, already overwhelmed by the pressure of the office, passed away before the full details became public. Fall, once a trusted ally, became the first former cabinet member sent to prison, and the man most responsible for destroying Harding's legacy. Calvin Coolidge believed government should stay out of the economy, and during his presidency, the stock market soared. But behind the boom was Charles E. Mitchell, president of the National City Bank, who pioneered risky lending and speculative schemes that fueled the bubble. Coolidge ignored warnings about overheated markets and rising inequality. While the crash didn't come until after he left office, Mitchell's aggressive financial tactics and Coolidge's refusal to regulate them set the stage for the Great Depression. Mitchell would later be investigated for fraud, but by then, the damage was done. As the Great Depression deepened, Herbert Hoover clung to a philosophy of limited government, even as banks collapsed and millions lost their jobs. Franklin D. Roosevelt emerged as his sharpest critic, promising bold action where Hoover had hesitated. On the campaign trail, FDR mocked Hoover's inaction and offered Americans a New Deal. The contrast was devastating. Hoover faced jeering crowds and collapsing support. By 1932, Roosevelt had become the embodiment of Hoover's national rejection. As World War II exploded across Europe and Asia, Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a global alliance of fascist powers unlike anything in history. And so for this president, we're naming three dangerous enemies. Adolf Hitler's Germany rolled across the continent, Mussolini's Italy pushed into Africa, and Tojo's Japan launched a brutal campaign across the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR led the nation into a total war on three fronts. The Axis powers threatened not only America's allies and interests, but the survival of democracy itself. No other U.S. president had faced such a coordinated and existential military threat. When Harry S. Truman took office, World War II was still raging, but it was Stalin who quickly emerged as his most dangerous adversary. The Soviet leader broke promises made at Yalta, installed communist regimes across Eastern Europe, and blockaded Berlin. The Cold War began under Truman's watch, forcing him to create the Truman Doctrine, fund the Marshall Plan, and establish NATO. Stalin's expansionist ambitions made him the dominant threat to American power, setting the stage for decades of global tension, and Truman was the first to confront it. As leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev brought Cold War tensions to a boiling point during Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency. He crushed the Hungarian uprising, threatened the West Bank over Berlin, and ramped up the arms race. In 1960, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory, and Khrushchev used the incident to humiliate Eisenhower on the world stage, abruptly canceling a key summit. The confrontation shattered any hope of thawing relations and reminded the world that the nuclear standoff was far from over. John F. Kennedy inherited Khrushchev as his main rival from his predecessor Eisenhower, and the Cold War immediately escalated. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Khrushchev saw Kennedy as weak and moved to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within hours of nuclear war. Kennedy, under immense pressure, imposed a naval blockade and negotiated a tense back-channel resolution. Though the crisis ended peacefully, Khrushchev had tested Kennedy to the limit, and the confrontation became the most dangerous moment of the nuclear age. Ho Chi Minh's communist government in North Vietnam turned Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency into a grinding, unwinnable war. As the Viet Cong launched ambushes and insurgent campaigns across South Vietnam, Johnson escalated U.S. involvement, committing hundreds of thousands of troops. Ho refused to negotiate on American terms, and every battlefield victory seemed to bring more domestic protest at home. The war overshadowed Johnson's sweeping domestic reforms and forced him to abandon a re-election bid. Ho Chi Minh never faced Johnson directly, but he outlasted him politically and strategically. As the first Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox posed a direct threat to Richard Nixon's presidency. When Cox subpoenaed secret Oval Office tapes, Nixon ordered him to drop the case. Cox refused. In response, Nixon tried to fire him. The backlash shattered Nixon's support in Congress and pushed the investigation into overdrive. Cox challenged the limits of Nixon's power that eventually led to his resignation. In 1976, Gerald Ford faced a challenge not from Democrats, but from within his own party. Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, mounted a fierce conservative revolt against Ford's moderate leadership. He criticized Ford's economic policies and even his choice of vice president. The GOP primary fight went down to the wire, splitting the party and forcing Ford to drop Nelson Rockefeller from the ticket. Ford barely secured the nomination, but Reagan had already weakened him for the general election. When the Iranian Revolution overthrew the U.S.-backed Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power as a fierce critic of America. In 1979, Iranian militants seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American hostages. The crisis dragged on for 444 days, dominating headlines and making Carter appear powerless. A failed rescue mission only deepened the humiliation. Khomeini refused all diplomatic overtures and timed the hostages' release for the day Carter left office. The episode crippled his presidency and ensured his defeat in the 1980 election. While the Cold War defined Reagan's presidency, no foreign leader challenged him more personally than Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi funded terrorist groups, backed violent attacks on Americans, and openly mocked Reagan on the world stage. After a Berlin nightclub bombing took out U.S. servicemen in 1986, Reagan responded with airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, targeting Gaddafi's own compound. Gaddafi survived and kept stirring unrest, but Reagan made him a symbol of state-sponsored terror, and the only leader he tried to take out. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in 1990, Saddam Hussein became George H.W. Bush's chief adversary overnight. Saddam defied international demands, threatening global oil supplies, and warned of a mother of all battles if the U.S. intervened. Bush built a global coalition and launched Operation Desert Storm, driving Iraqi forces out in a matter of weeks. Though the war was a military success, Saddam remained in power and would haunt American foreign policy for years to come. Independent counsel Ken Starr began investigating a failed land deal, but eventually uncovered Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. Starr's relentless probe led to the president's impeachment for perjury and obstruction of justice. Though Clinton survived the Senate trial and left office with high approval ratings, the scandal dominated his second term and weakened his political standing. Starr had become the symbol of Clinton's loss of control over his own presidency. Osama bin Laden was the architect of the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda operatives struck New York and Washington. Nearly 3,000 people perished, and the war on terror had begun. Bush responded with military action in Afghanistan and later Iraq, shaping U.S. foreign policy around the goal of defeating Islamic extremism. Bin Laden evaded capture for the rest of Bush's presidency, but his actions defined Bush's legacy more than any other single figure. Barack Obama inherited a weakened al-Qaeda, but by his second term, a new threat emerged. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi led the Islamic State, seizing territory in Iraq and Syria and declaring a caliphate. ISIS carried out mass executions, enslaved civilians, and inspired global terror attacks. Under Obama, the U.S. launched an international coalition to strike ISIS targets, eventually degrading their control. Baghdadi represented a resurgence of violent extremism and posed the most serious foreign threat of Obama's presidency. As Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi became Donald Trump's most visible domestic adversary. She led both impeachment proceedings against him, first over the Ukraine scandal, then again following the Capitol riot on January 6th. Their rivalry dominated the political landscape. Pelosi used her control of the House to block Trump's agenda, investigate his administration, and publicly challenge his authority. The clash between them was personal, constant, and defining. Vladimir Putin tested Joe Biden from the start. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, forcing Biden to orchestrate a sweeping international response. He imposed heavy sanctions, sent military aid to Kyiv, and rallied NATO to deter further aggression. Putin also waged cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns against the West, possibly targeting elections and infrastructure. The war in Ukraine became the centerpiece of Biden's foreign policy, and Putin the clearest threat to global stability during his term. And for Trump's final term, let me throw it out to you. What do you think? Who is his biggest rival, challenger, most dangerous enemy? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you liked the video, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And there should be another video on your screen about presidents right now, so check it out. Thanks for watching. See you next time.